Hey everybody, Olive here. Today I am bringing you my Nonfiction November TBR as well as giving you some nonfiction recommendations. If you missed my announcement video, I will put a link to it down below. But to give you the Reader's Digest version, I am hosting a nonfiction reading challenge in the month of November along with Gemma at Non Fic Books. This is a pretty casual challenge where we're just challenging you to read more nonfiction than you normally would, but really challenging you to read one nonfiction book a week for the entire month of November. In order to give you a little bit of direction, we gave you 4 broad categories of nonfiction from which you can choose books to satisfy that challenge. The 4 categories that Gemma and I chose were history, science and nature, culture and society, and biography and memoir. Of course, we'd like to see everyone try to read 4 nonfiction books throughout the month, but because this is casual and because we know that that can be an unrealistic expectation, especially for people who are not used to reading nonfiction, it's going to be very flexible. There are a ton of nonfiction books out there that will contain elements of more than one of those categories. Before I give you my TBR for Nonfiction November, I wanted to give you 4 recommendations of nonfiction books that I love that would easily fit into more than one of the challenge categories. The first one is a book that I listened to this year, but since bought a physical copy of, and that is Quiet: The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. This is by Susan Cain. I think a lot of readers will be able to identify with a lot of the things said in this book because I do think readers have a higher propensity of being introverts. I myself am introverted and I took a lot out of this book. I really like that this book addresses the fact that extroverts are considered the preferred type of personality, but this book really talks about how important both extroverts and introverts are in the functioning of society. There is also a very interesting segment in this book about people who are sensitive, and not like emotionally sensitive, but people who are sensitive to external stimuli. Sensitive people, of course, tend to be introverts, but they can be extroverts as well. Overall, this is a really fantastic book. It was a great learning experience for me. I think extroverts or introverts would be able to gain a lot of knowledge by reading this book. So yeah, this is definitely one of my favorite pieces of nonfiction. I believe that this book would satisfy both the culture and society category as well as the science category. There are elements of both of those in here. When it comes to the history and biography / memoir portions, of course, I have to recommend Catherine the Great's Portrait of a Woman by Robert K. Massey. Robert K. Massey is a fantastic biographer of Russian historical figures. I have read the majority of his works, almost done with all of them. I really love his work Nicholas and Alexandra, and that was my favorite Massey book for a really long time, until this one came out. This book talks about Catherine the Great in a way that makes her seem so human and so relatable, but you also see just how smart she was. It says Portrait of a Woman. This is exactly what this book is. There was not one portion of this that I found boring, which can often happen in biographies that have a political element to them. Catherine's life was absolutely fascinating. Obviously, I recommend it very, very highly. This next book not only deals with Russia, but could satisfy 3 categories: culture and society, history, and biography memoir, and that is Mastering the Art of Soviet Cooking by Anya von Bremzen. This is a hysterically funny food memoir / food cultural history of Russia during the Soviet period. Anya von Bremzen was born in the Soviet Union and emigrated with her mother when she was a teenager. This book talks about her experience with food from the time that she was young, what the Soviet Union was saying about food, what was culturally important about food in the Soviet Union, which is something that I had never known about before, despite knowing everything that I do know about Russian history. Anya von Bremzen is witty and sarcastic. You just want to keep reading even when she's talking about what might otherwise be a very boring historical political section of the book. At one point, she calls Putin an obscure midget with a boring KGB past. if that tells you anything. It made me laugh so hard that I can remember it word for word to this day, obviously. I cannot recommend this one highly enough. I will probably recommend it in several videos in the future, and I definitely will want to reread it at some point. I love this book. Now, I really love those 3 books. Like, really loved those 3 books. Like, gave them all 5 stars, loved them. But this next one is probably my favorite out of the 4 I'm going to show you. This book could be considered a history book, or it could be considered a science book. And that book is The Poisoners Handbook, Murder and the Birth of Forensic Medicine in Jazz Age New York by Deborah Bloom. I read this one for an in real life book club, and I literally had to slow down my reading of it because I knew if I ingested it too quickly, I would not be able to recall anything for the book club meeting. Like I said, this book is part history, part science. It takes place in Jazz Age New York, so in the 1920s, where Prohibition is going strong, sort of. How to summarize this book. Have you ever wondered why poisonings a la Agatha Christie novels have really not been that prevalent in modern years? This book will tell you why. This book describes the way in which forensic medicine developed by means of solving poisoning killings. So in each chapter, you're looking at a specific poison. You get an example of a true crime case in which a person or persons were poisoned using that chapter's specific poison. That chapter will tell you the science behind that poison, what happens when that poison is ingested, and it talks about how scientists uncovered that people were using these poisons by learning how to test bodies for specific poisons. At the same time, you are getting, just as the title tells you, a history of the birth of forensic medicine, how it came about, which obviously includes the politics of that, and it highly focuses on prohibition and what people were drinking instead of ethyl alcohol and how bad it was for people's bodies. This was a little bit of everything. It was so delicious, pun intended. I cannot recommend this one highly enough, especially if you're interested in true crime, science, New York, prohibition. This one is so fantastic. So those were my recommendations for ways in which you could satisfy some of these reading challenges for Nonfiction November. But now I'd like to tell you what I'm going to be reading to satisfy the challenges. To meet the history challenge, I'm going to read something very saucy that I have hauled recently called Sex with Kings by Eleanor Herman. This book essentially talks about the history of mistresses of kings, and I think it should make for a very interesting read. In order to satisfy the science/nature requirements, I am planning on reading Genome, an autobiography of a species in 23 chapters by Matt Ridley. I am not confident enough in my ability to summarize this book properly since I am not a genetic scientist, so I am going to read you the back. Arguably the most significant scientific discovery of the new century, the mapping of the 23 pairs of chromosomes that make up the human genome raises almost as many questions as its answers. Questions that will profoundly impact the way we think about disease, about longevity, and about free will. Questions that will affect the rest of your life. Genome offers extraordinary insight into the ramifications of this incredible breakthrough. By picking one newly discovered gene from each pair of chromosomes and telling its story, Matt Ridley recounts the history of our species and its ancestors from the dawn of life to the brink of future medicine. He probes the scientific, philosophical, and moral issues arising as a result of the mapping of the genome and will help you understand what this scientific milestone means for you, for your children, and for humankind. I am supremely interested in genetics and genetic makeup. I think it's a really cool idea that it's going to be 23 chapters, and that in each chapter he's going to peer into one of the chromosomes and tell you something that's been newly discovered about it and what it means for humankind, basically. I'm really excited to read this one. I think it's going to be great. A really important one that I'm planning on reading to satisfy the society/culture category is Nickel and Dimed by Barbara Ehrenreich. This is a pretty popular one, and I, of course, am embarrassed I have not read it yet. I think it's very important to have read, and it talks about just how impossible it is to get by on minimum wage in America. This is something that I've always known, and I think this is going to be a very hard read, but will definitely open my eyes to something that I certainly should be aware of. And the last book that I'm planning on reading for Nonfiction November to satisfy the Biography/Memoir challenge is Lenin's Brother, The Origins of the October Revolution. This is by Philip Pomper. I could talk to you for years about Russian history and Lenin and Lenin's history and St. Petersburg and the Russian Revolution, but I'm just going to try to keep it brief in describing this book. Vladimir Lenin, who was the orchestrator of the October Revolution and went on to subsequently be the first leader of the Soviet Union, first became interested in politics when his older brother, Alexander, was assassinated by the Tsarist government for being involved in what was called the People's Will Movement. This was the same movement that had successfully assassinated Tsar Alexander II. The execution of Lenin's older brother obviously deeply affected him. It enraged him to the point of him entering politics himself. And the rest, as they say, is history. I know a good bit about Lenin, but I do not know a ton about his earlier life, which has been something I have been really interested in learning more about. I think this will be a biography of Lenin as much as it is going to be about his brother. I'm interested in both, so obviously I'm very excited. So those were some nonfiction recommendations and my TBR for Nonfiction November 2015. Again, if you've forgotten, there is a Goodreads group for Nonfiction November. I will put the link down below. I encourage you to join the Goodreads group. I encourage you to join in on this challenge. I would love to hear from you in the comments below about what you think about any of these books, if you're planning on participating, and if you are going to participate, letting me know what you're going to be reading. I am a book olive on both Twitter and Instagram, and the link to my personal Goodreads page is also down below if you would like to be friends. Happy reading! Go read some nonfiction. That's certainly what I'm going to go do. I will see you in my first weekly wrap-up for Nonfiction November. Have a good one. Bye.